Next, we want to look back in time to Africa in 1945, the year the Second World War ended 80 years ago. It's worth remembering that back then, nearly all of the continent was colonized by 5 European countries: Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, and Belgium. Only Egypt, Ethiopia, and Liberia were nominally independent. World War II, of course, was fought between Germany, Italy, and their allies on one side, facing off against the forces of Britain, France, and their allies. It's estimated that more than 1 million Africans served as combatants, as well as laborers and carriers in World War II for the European powers. Images of colonial troops are rare, but look at these. A Senegalese French colonial soldier, for example, who joined the Allies in North Africa being spoken to by a French officer. The image is from late 1942. Some Africans were captured in battle. These are another 2 Senegalese soldiers who had been fighting for France before they were taken into a German prisoner of war camp in 1940. But more than half of colonial troops were enlisted by Britain. The 11th East Africa Infantry Division, seen here in 1944, was made up of soldiers from the modern-day nations of Kenya, Uganda, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. The division fought with the British Army in Burma, now Myanmar, but more on that later. 80 years on, there are not many surviving Black African veterans, but we've tracked down a few to hear their experiences. First in South Africa, from where 80,000 recruits made up the Native Military Corps, which supported the Allies. The South African Museum of Military History in Johannesburg is one of the few places keeping their legacy alive. These soldiers served in non-combat roles, mostly in North Africa, where some of the war's biggest battles on African soil were fought. Part of that contingent was Elias Suamotse, who's now 101 years old. He spoke to DW at his home in Soweto.
We got guns when we arrived there. All of us were armed. We only got 3 weeks of training with those guns. They told us we should start our work. When we arrived at the base, I suddenly felt scared. Also, we didn't get white bread, like white soldiers, or sugar. We didn't get eggs, and we didn't get butter.
Kenya was one of the British Army's most important recruiting grounds. Many young men signed up hoping for better social and economic opportunities. DW's Sela Oneko has been to Machakos, just outside Nairobi, to hear from one of the veterans.
The Burma Star, a reminder of Muindi Mudhumbi Kawali's service in the Second World War. He served as a driver for the King's African Rifle, a division of African soldiers who fought Britain's enemies as far away as Burma, today's Myanmar.
The people who were giving us commands to advance and move forward, were white soldiers with a star on their shoulder. They took the soldiers to the front to fight. And if many of your people died, then we would retreat.
As Kenyan soldiers, Mudhumbi says, they knew very little about the war. They couldn't speak English and were simply moved from place to place. Today, he's 111 years old. He lives with his son and family. He still has his service certificate and even a metal eating bowl marked with his service number.
20001. They also used to write this number on a chain, which you wore around your neck.
Some of the war's major battles were fought as far away as Burma, where East African soldiers faced off against the Japanese and against Italians in Ethiopia and Somalia. It's a little-known fact in Europe. Over 98,000 Kenyans served in World War II. They served as drivers, porters, and soldiers. They fought for Britain, a country that wasn't their own and that had colonized their homeland. This memorial in the center of Nairobi honors their sacrifice, but their stories are largely unknown, and the veterans themselves have received little recognition. A year ago, Muthumbi received another medal from Britain, and after lobbying from a Commonwealth Veterans Association, he's been receiving a small grant for upkeep for the past 2 years. But other than that, it's his souvenirs and marching songs like these that keep the memory alive.
And my next guest is well qualified to tell us more about this. He is the author of the book Another Man's War, the story of a Burma boy in Britain's forgotten African army. Barnaby Phillips, welcome to DW News Africa.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Our pleasure. Barnaby, this is a story we don't often hear about. First, talk to me about the title, which I find striking, and I suspect will also give us a sense of why you were compelled to write the book in the first place.
Well, I was always fascinated, Michael. I grew up in Kenya, in East Africa, and later I worked for the BBC in Nigeria. And I was fascinated to learn about the history of the so-called Burma boys, that is the 100,000 or so black Africans which the British took to Burma to fight against the Japanese during the Second World War. I'm not a military historian. I wasn't interested in brigades or battalions or how many millimeters there are in your mortars and all the rest of it. I was interested in the human element. What made these people go and fight for the British Empire? Were they compelled to do so? Did they want to do so? How did they end up in another man's war?
I want to get to that in a moment, but first, you focus this story on Isaac Farayebo. What, in a nutshell, is his story?
Isaac Farayebo was a wonderful Nigerian man. I knew him in his old age. He signed up, like so many, in the early 1940s, not knowing what he would get himself into. He was shipped off to Burma, a place he knew nothing about, to fight the Japanese, a people he knew nothing about. His unit was ambushed very, very quickly, hopelessly ill-prepared. British officers with him were killed, and he ended up spending 9 months with a fellow injured West African soldier behind Japanese lines, deep in the jungle. They only survived because local villagers took pity on them. 9 months later, the British retook that area, and Isaac returned to Nigeria. He was briefly famous in 1945 upon his return, and he lived the rest of his life in respectable obscurity as a civil servant. I got to know him in his 80s. I was delighted to discover he was still alive, and I was able to revive his story and do justice to it shortly before he passed away.
Indeed, it's a fascinating story. Let's stay in that era for a moment. Why did young men like Isaac risk their lives for their colonial masters?
I think for a variety of reasons, Michael, and this is important to say. I think there were some Africans for whom the British message, the British propaganda, if you like, that this was Hitler's war, that Hitler was a terrible man, and that if Germany were to win the Second World War, things would be a lot worse for black Africans than it was in the British Empire. That message had some resonance. And so there were people who volunteered to go and fight in what the British called Hitler's war. There were others, undoubtedly, who were compelled. There are very reliable accounts of people being picked up without the right papers, let's say, in Kampala, Uganda. Before they knew it, they were in conscription camps in Kenya. In places like northern Nigeria, which was an important recruiting center, the British had a cozy relationship with the emirs, that is, the traditional rulers. And so they would go to an emir and say, you know what, we need an extra 30 chaps from your area. And the emir might well get rid of young people who he thought were troublemakers or people who were in some way obstacles to him. And so things worked in that regard. But I think the most important and the largest group, and this is important to say, were people like Isaac, who simply signed up voluntarily because going to fight in the British Army was the best option open to them at that time. And so, if you like, they were exercising their free will. Yes, you may well say they were being exploited as well, but I would put it to you, how different is that, say, a young British boy, 17, 18, from Manchester or Leeds, who went to fight in, say, Afghanistan or Iraq in 2003?
So they sign up and they find themselves perhaps in a place like Isaac in Burma. What was the general experience for Black African soldiers in colonial armies? It's the early 1940s. Do you receive the same deployments, rise to the same ranks, or share the same status as your white counterpart?
No, you don't. I mean, the British Empire is a racial construct, and the army is built along racial lines. In the late 1930s, the British, aware that a war with fascism was looming, changed some of the rules and made it theoretically possible for a Black African soldier to achieve officer status. That is a lieutenant, captain, major, and so on. That was very, very theoretical. I think it happened once or possibly twice. The vast majority of Black African soldiers fought under white British officers. They were paid reliably, but less than white British soldiers. And of course, the war against the Japanese was a very tough war, fought in the jungle. Here in Britain, the white British soldiers who came back from Burma said that they were the forgotten army, that so much of the focus had been on the war in Europe and liberating Europe from Nazism. Well, I put it to your viewers that within the forgotten army, these Black African divisions are the forgotten divisions, if you like.
My understanding is, although units were headed, of course, by white commissioned officers, they were largely segregated. Still, sometimes African and European troops would find themselves fighting side by side. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, that's right. The nature of the war in Burma was an intimate war, a jungle war, where small units were often marching many days. And they had to rely on each other. They had to know each other. And so, for example, British officers who took the trouble to learn Swahili, because there were large units from East Africa who were in the King's African Regiment, or Hausa, which was the typical lingua franca of the West African soldiers, they would fare much better. But I think at an individual level, for many of the Black African soldiers, this was a transformative experience, because let's say you came from Nigeria before the Second World War. Well, really, the only white people you knew was perhaps a missionary, a distant colonial official. Well, now there you were, cheek by jowl in the jungle with a soldier from Britain, and you came to see all sorts of things. You came to see that white British soldier was perhaps more frightened than you, perhaps less competent than you, perhaps not as strong as you, or perhaps a mixture of some of those things. You simply learned that you were all humans under the most extreme circumstances. And that was a liberating experience, I would say.
I'm really curious, as I'm sure many people listening are as well. What happened to African veterans after the war?
Well, the vast majority went back. And of course, the British had largely recruited from quite remote rural areas. So you'd go back to northern Nigeria or certain parts of Kenya. You had a bit of money in your pocket. Perhaps you bought a bicycle. Perhaps you bought a new pair of boots. Perhaps you had a bit more prestige in the village to which you returned, which had, after all, been perhaps your ambition. It was perhaps that much easier, for example, to get married, to move on in life. But by and large, your experience, I would suggest, was fairly quickly, if not forgotten, but fairly quickly irrelevant to the societies to which you return. Because let's not forget, Michael, of course, that many of these countries in Africa, quite quickly after the Second World War, became independent. That had not been envisaged by the British. It wasn't necessarily envisaged within these societies. And then this group of large ex-servicemen who had fought for the British Empire were an anomaly, embarrassing at best, a potential threat at worst. So it was a complex situation.
And that delivers me nicely to my last question, Barnaby, which is, why have African contributions in this war been largely overlooked?
I think for the reason I suggested there, Michael, they don't really fit into the narrative. They don't fit into the cosy British narrative, which is one of we stood alone against Nazism, as is sometimes said in this country. We liberated Europe. Well, of course, that in itself overlooks the extraordinary contribution of the Soviet Union and the United States. But parking that to one side, the war in Burma was a a much messier affair in which the British Empire was trying to retain its status in the Far East against a rising empire, which was Japan, above all to protect India, and in which we conscripted huge amounts of soldiers from a third part of the world, Africa. So that's not such a comfortable narrative for the British, but it doesn't really fit into post-colonial African history either, in which you have, if you like, fragile new nation states trying to forge a new sense of national unity. Well, they need their myths too. Perhaps it's the myths of fighting up against the colonial oppressor. Perhaps it's trying to forge a nation under difficult circumstances. And again, this group of men who fought for the British Empire don't easily fit into that story.
We will have to end it there. It's been a pleasure. Writer and journalist Barnaby Phillips, thank you.
Great pleasure, Michael.